In our headlines on this Wednesday afternoon, December 27th, here in South Korea. The Yoon administration has slapped new sanctions against North Korea to mark its 14th round of such punitive measures since entering office in response to Pyongyang's provocations, which included several ICBM testings this year. Meanwhile, on the local front, fewer than 20,000 babies were born in the month of October, a first for the month, leading to a further fall in the country's natural population, which has been declining since November 2019. Over in Gaza, a shift in Israel's counter-offensive strategy is looking to take shape, with its high-intensity ground mission against the Palestinian militant group Hamas turning into a low-intensity operation over a longer time frame. We start with news of more targeted punitive measures by the Yoon administration against North Korean individuals in light of their regime's most recent ICBM testings. Our defense correspondent Kim Jong-un has details.
South Korea has slapped a fresh round of sanctions on North Korea in response to the regime's most recent launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile on December 18th. Seoul's foreign ministry announced Wednesday that it has targeted 8 individuals. All 8 were reportedly involved in generating profits for the North Korean regime and financing nuclear weapons and missile programs through illegal cyber activities and trading sanctioned materials, including weapons. Among those on the list is Lee Sun-kyun, the head of the regime's Reconnaissance General Bureau, also known as the organization behind North Korean hacking groups such as Kim Suk-ki, Lazarus, and Andariel. Lee is accused of gaining foreign currency and stealing technology through illicit cyber activities. Park Yong-han was also sanctioned for trading weapons-related goods on behalf of Korea Mining and Development Trading Corporation, North Korea's primary arms dealer. North Korean diplomat Yoon reportedly traded lithium-6, a UN-prohibited nuclear-related item. The remaining listed individuals are affiliated with Pan Systems Pyongyang, an organization sanctioned by the South Korean government in 2016 and were involved in trading North Korean-made weapons. South Korea's foreign ministry also warned that Pyongyang's provocations would come with a price. It vowed to cooperate more closely with the international community, including the US and Japan, to ensure that the regime realizes that it must stop its provocations and engage in denuclearization talks. With the sanctions now in place, those wishing to engage in financial transactions with these individuals must obtain permission from the governor of the Bank of Korea or the Financial Services Commission. The latest measures are the 14th round of sanctions to be put in place against Pyongyang since the beginning of the Yoon administration. Since October last year, South Korea has targeted 83 individuals and 53 institutions. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News.
Staying with North Korea, curtains have gone up on a key policy meeting, with Kim Jong-un opening the event on Tuesday by calling the year 2023 as one of great change. According to the regime's state-run media on this Wednesday, Kim applauded advances in all areas, including the military, claiming a path to national power and prestige has been paved. The meeting sets the stage for policy directions for the year ahead, and in recent times have been held twice a year as opposed to once. And given the persistent security concerns on the Korean peninsula, the Yoon administration is believed to have initiated a bold diplomatic realignment by seeking a solid trilateral security framework, including the US and Japan. For more on the administration's foreign policy of the past year, here is our senior top office correspondent, Oh Soo-young.
South Korea's trilateral cooperation with the United States and Japan was at the core of President Yoon Suk-yeol's summit diplomacy in 2023. First, South Korea's military-focused alliance with the US, based on the Mutual Defense Treaty signed 70 years ago, became a global comprehensive strategic alliance, broadening their scope of cooperation to areas like tech, climate, energy and more. This came as Presidents Yoon and Joe Biden announced the Washington Declaration in April amid North Korea's growing nuclear threat, setting out new measures to boost confidence in America's extended deterrence policy. This created the creation of the Nuclear Consultative Group, under which the two sides will discuss and develop joint nuclear response guidelines to a potential North Korean nuclear strike. The document was also a major step towards the Camp David trilateral agreements with Japan in mid-August. After the rapprochement between Seoul and Tokyo, the three leaders inked documents on their shared commitment and course of action for Indo-Pacific security and prosperity, joint responses to North Korea's security threat through missile information sharing and combined military drills, and an agreement to consult each other on regional security challenges. With over a dozen diplomatic trips this year, the South Korean leader also expanded Seoul's diplomatic horizons, given the continued geopolitical risks to global security and economies that challenge the post-war world order of globalization, free trade and multilateral institutions. Thus, Yoon has been pushing for value-based multilateral cooperation for a rules-based world order to stabilize trade and regional security and tackle climate, digital and global development challenges. He pledged Seoul's contributive diplomacy, even visiting Ukraine to show South Korea's value-based solidarity and leading global discussions on establishing new digital norms on areas like artificial intelligence. But particularly with a focus on economic security, Yoon called himself the salesman of Korea, aiming to procure critical supply chains and energy sources and strike up partnerships on developing new advanced technologies for South Korea's export-dependent economy. Major deals include the Downing Street Accords with the UK on deepening security and economic ties, including jointly developing quantum technology that could neutralize North Korean missiles. A semiconductor alliance was forged with the Netherlands to work on cutting-edge R&D in the technology, which is South Korea's #1 export item. Yoon also strengthened ties with Southeast Asian countries, sealing deals on mineral cooperation and closer trade with Vietnam and Indonesia. State visits to the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, followed by a bilateral free trade agreement with Abu Dhabi, marked a new timely chapter for South Korea's Middle East diplomacy, as the post-oil era brings both crises and opportunities to Arab states as crude suppliers and South Korea as a major importer. Next year, economic security will likely continue topping the diplomatic agenda as Seoul looks to develop new export industries in areas like bio, defense, smart agriculture and nuclear plants. 오수영, Arirang News.
Over in Ukraine, at least one person was killed and 4 others injured in a Russian attack on a railway station in the southern city of Kherson on Tuesday. According to Ukrainian authorities, the attack took place as some 140 people were preparing for an evacuation mission. Separately, Ukraine launched an airstrike on Crimea also on Tuesday, which destroyed a Russian naval vessel specialized in tank landings. According to Russian authorities, the ship has suffered extensive damage. This latest assault marks Russia's 3rd major loss of military equipment in a week. Meanwhile, in Gaza, a shift in Israel's counter-offensive strategy is looking to take shape with its high-intensity ground mission against Hamas turning into a low-intensity operation over a longer time frame. Our Lee Sun-kyun explains.
The Israeli military says it's now preparing to shift its war operations from high-intensity fighting in Gaza to a low-intensity, long-term military action. The move comes as Washington has been calling on Israel to ease up on its heavy bombardment of Gaza and focus its attacks on Hamas infrastructure to limit civilian casualties. Israel Defense Forces Chief Herzi Halazi said Tuesday that its military is expanding its fighting in southern and central Gaza, adding that it is close to dismantling all Hamas battalions in northern regions. He said many Hamas soldiers and commanders have surrendered, with hundreds being held prisoner. However, he warned that the fight would last for many more months, saying there can be no shortcuts taken when dismantling an entire organization. While the armed conflict in Gaza nears the 3-month mark, the World Food Programme warns that as the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip is worsening, the region has now entered the so-called food crisis stage. The WFP announced on Tuesday that all 2.2 million residents of Gaza are in a state of acute food insecurity. The UN agency regularly evaluates and predicts the food situation in Gaza, with the recent assessment forecasting the situation from December to February of next year. Meanwhile, the UN named an outgoing Dutch minister as its humanitarian coordinator for Gaza on Tuesday. Sigrid Kaag, who had been the Netherlands' deputy prime minister and finance minister since January 2022, will oversee the humanitarian situation in the region. The appointment comes as the UN Security Council last week called for the safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale, but did not call for an immediate halt to fighting. Lee Sun-kyun, Arirang News.
I'm not going to.
Consumers this month believe prices will ease in the year ahead to 3.2%, which is the lowest in almost 2 years. Our Yoon reports.
The Bank of Korea released results of its consumer sentiment survey on Wednesday, which shows consumer inflation expectations have dropped this month compared to the month before, amid a downward trend in consumer prices. In December, expected inflation for the year ahead was 3.2%. That's down 0.2 percentage points from the previous month, marking the lowest figure in 20 months since April last year. The central bank poll also showed the Composite Consumer Sentiment Index, or CCSI, reversed a 4-month downward streak that began in August. For December, the figure stood at 99.5, up 2.3 points from the previous month, still below the 100-point threshold, indicating that pessimists outnumber optimists. BOK officials say the improvement is due to a slowdown in rising interest rates amid hints that the cycle of U.S. Federal Reserve rate hikes has come to an end. The CCSI is used to gauge overall consumer sentiment, including for current living standards, prospective household income, and prospective spending, all of which are standardized. The central bank had expected inflation to reach a target rate of 2% by the end of this year, but now predicts inflationary pressure to continue into next year, with inflation expected to stay over 3% around the end of 2023. 이은진, Arirang News.
Korea is maintaining its import restrictions on Japanese seafood. Remarks to this end were shared by First Vice Minister for Government Policy and Coordination Park Koo-yeon earlier on Tuesday, in response to Japanese media reports detailing Tokyo's plans to expand its exports of scallops to Korea and the European Union amid China's import ban. Currently, Seoul has in place bans on seafood from 8 prefectures near Fukushima. The latest monthly data on Korea's population is doing little to ease concerns over the country's birth rates. Our Moon Hae-ryun has more on the numbers for October, which saw fewer than 20,000 babies.
South Korea saw its birth rate plummet while the number of deaths rose, leading to a natural population decline in October. Data released by Statistics Korea on Wednesday show that the total number of births recorded came to just under 19,000, a decrease of more than 8% compared to the same month last year. It's the first time that this figure has dipped below the 20,000 mark for any month of October since data was first compiled in 1981. The number of deaths was also the highest for any October, coming to over 30,000, which is a 3.4% rise on year. The country has seen a natural decline in the population since November 2019, and October of this year was no exception. Natural decline is calculated by subtracting the number of deaths from the number of births, meaning a figure for October of 11,889. This is the biggest drop in the natural population for any month of October ever recorded. Meanwhile, the number of marriages rose compared to both the month before and October 2022. The number of registered marriages came to just under 16,000, which is a 1% increase on year and more than 3,000 more than September this year. According to a Statistics Korea spokesperson, the reason for the rise is the fact that October has always been more popular than September for weddings. But July, August and September this year saw on-year declines unlike October. And the reason given for this was that the number of marriages saw a sharp rise in the second half of last year due to the easing of COVID-19 restrictions, meaning that the base value for last year was high. That being said, October this year saw an increase, and more observation will be needed over the coming months to see whether the marriage market is seeing a recovery or whether this is simply an anomaly. Meanwhile, the number of divorces also saw an on-year rise of 6%. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
The average hourly wage of women workers in Korea rose last year to 70% that of their male counterparts. A joint report by Seoul's Gender and Labour Ministries released on Wednesday shows both permanent and temporary female workers earned some $14 an hour on average in 2022, while men earned around $20 an hour. The report also reveals the employment rate gap between men and women shrank to 18.6% last year from 22.5% a decade ago. In other news, Korean actor Lee Sun-kyun was found dead earlier on this Wednesday morning by local authorities. The 48-year-old was found unconscious in a car at a park in central Seoul with a charcoal briquette in the passenger seat. Now, he is best known for his part in the Oscar-winning film Parasite and has been under investigation for alleged drug abuse since October. Marking its 20th anniversary, K-pop group TVXQ released an album for the first time in 5 years. The duo, You Know, and Max Changmin dropped their 9th full-length album, 20 & 2, on Tuesday, the anniversary of their debut. The album features 10 songs, including the title track, Rebel. The group will also hold a 2-day concert at the Inspire Arena over in Incheon this coming weekend. Originally a 5-member group, TVXQ became a duo in 2010 after the departure of 3 members amid a legal dispute over their contract with SM Entertainment.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. The Turkish Parliament's Foreign Affairs Commission has approved Sweden's bid to join NATO on Tuesday. Sweden's accession will now have to be approved at the General Assembly of the Turkish Parliament. Turkey's decision on Tuesday marks a key step towards the expansion of the Western military alliance, as Turkey has been delaying its approval for 19 months, demanding security-related concessions from Sweden. Turkey's change of position is linked to the US backing the sales of F-16 fighter jets, a condition which Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan openly requested in return for the ratification of Sweden's NATO membership. The Turkish Foreign Affairs Commission is controlled by Erdogan's ruling Justice and Development Party, which also holds a majority of seats in the parliament together with its allies, meaning Sweden's NATO bid is likely to be approved in the General Assembly. The United States on Tuesday banned the import of Apple Watches. The import ban comes from a patent dispute between Apple and medical technology company Masimo. Apple has lodged an appeal, but the current ban will hold until at least January 12th, when the US Customs and Border Protection will decide whether to accept Apple's request to pause the sales ban while the court considers its appeal and the redesigned versions of the Apple Watch. The US International Trade Commission ordered banning of imports and sales of Apple Watches following a complaint filed by Masimo accusing Apple of poaching its employees and stealing its blood oxygen level measuring technology, which has been featured in Apple's smartwatches since its Series 6 model in 2020. The import and sales ban is likely to affect the new Series 9 and Ultra 2 Apple Watches the most. In Nigeria's north-central plateau state, reports on Tuesday confirmed the killing of at least 140 people by gunmen over the weekend. The attacks were the latest in a series of mass killings in the West African nation this year, which the government blames on an ongoing farmer-herder crisis. According to the state's governor, the assailants targeted 17 communities in senseless and unprovoked attacks on Saturday and Sunday. Amnesty International confirmed 140 deaths but expects the death toll to rise. While no group has claimed responsibility, authorities are pointing to nomadic herders who have been accused of other similar incidents in the region amid ongoing conflict over access to land and water. In the US, a 6-year-old boy traveling alone to visit his grandmother for Christmas was put on a wrong flight. The boy ended up in Orlando, Florida, hundreds of kilometers away from his original destination, Fort Myers, Florida. The boy left on a Spirit Airlines flight from Philadelphia under supervision of an airline's employee, but somehow boarded the wrong plane, ending up around 260 kilometers away from where his grandmother was waiting to pick him up. The grandmother, Maria Ramos, drove to Orlando Airport from Southwest Airport in Fort Myers and picked up the child. The airline has offered to reimburse her. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. We are getting relief from the severe cold wave this week, with temperatures ranging similar to yesterday, hovering above the seasonal norms. But of course, it's that unwelcome fine dust, as western parts of Korea are engulfed by high levels of dust. More smog has moved in overnight, so it will be dustier today and for the remainder of the week. Meanwhile, East Coast regions are being gripped by dry air, with a dry advisory remaining in place with strong winds. Seoul sees a high of 7 degrees, Busan at 12, Jeju at 13 degrees Celsius. Skies will be mostly sunny for the central regions, Gyeongsang-Pukdo and Jeollabuk-do, but the rest of the country will see clouds passing by. But, dust-free regions should take advantage of the fine winter weather today. New Year's weekend is shaping up to be a snowy one, so travelers need to be mindful of the snow and plan accordingly, but at least there will not be a major cold snap. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And on that note, we end Wednesday's afternoon newscast. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session. Do stay with us.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music start.
Welcome. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's lying? Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
I'm live. 저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해주시는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 억지 텐션 같은데 아니라고 아무도 안 하는 거고.
좋아요.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Security concerns on the peninsula kept the two Koreas in foreign media headlines this year as well, with Seoul seeking a tougher stance against Pyongyang, whose provocations included 3 separate launches of its Hwasong-18 ICBM in 2023. Hello and welcome. You're watching Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we have our panel of foreign journalists and their thoughts on a number of developments here in this part of the world this year. For this, I have Jack Barton here in the studio with me. Jack, welcome back as always.
Always a pleasure to be here.
I also have Stephen Borwick with us. Stephen, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Jack, let's begin then with Seoul's foreign policy. How far do you suppose has the Yoon administration advanced in terms of becoming a global pivotal state, do you think?
I think there's some real momentum there, but it's worth remembering that it's not the first administration to seek a global policy. Even under Im Young-bak, there was the Global Korea, and most administrations have sought, to sort of expand Korea's role. It's a long time since anyone thought of South Korea as a shrimp amongst whales. It's gone from middle power and now it's seeking to be a bigger power in that. But there is a difference. In the past, often it was talking about economic integration across the globe, having a bigger economic footprint or maybe a bigger cultural footprint. And certainly President Yoon is following in that tradition. We've seen economic growth in a lot of areas, even in non-traditional areas like exporting nuclear power technology. The arms industry is becoming very big. But I think the really big difference here is we say the value element of this policy. So Yoon keeps talking about freedom, peace, liberal, democratic policies and entwining this in the engagement that he seeks. In his inauguration address, we saw freedom mentioned 20 times. In the UN address, freedom mentioned 18 times. We've seen a much bigger engagement with human rights issues, even when it comes to criticizing China in the UN. which is very unusual. And a lot of the policies now really are tied to this vision of South Korea as not just an economic powerhouse, but also a sort of an example of a shining democracy in the region. And one area that South Korea can play a big role, of course, is countries that are emerging from poverty and war, or poverty and war, and want a path to prosperity. South Korea, of course, has experience in this beyond, we could say, any other country in the history of the world. And this is somewhere that it can play a big role, and it's trying to play a big role. It's still a policy in motion, but I think overall there's some very positive elements of this policy.
Right, and staying with its policy, Stephen, some claim that the Yoon administration has initiated a bold diplomatic realignment, especially in consideration of its Indo-Pacific strategy. How do you respond to this description, and what do you suppose have been its implications this year?
I don't know if realignment is the best word, because I think if you look at what the Yoon administration has done, the U.S. is still the centerpiece of the country's diplomatic approach, and it's been that way for a very long time. I mean, even under more left-wing administrations, the relationship with the U.S. has always been quite strong. I think what you see is more a kind of a refining of certain things and a deepening of certain things. I mean, as Jack pointed out, pretty much every South Korean president approaches the job of foreign policy with the context in mind that this is a relatively small export-dependent economy. And so it makes sense for South Korean presidents to approach the world in a way where they seek to deepen partnerships with countries where there is demand for South Korean products, or where there is scope to cooperate in areas such as defense, trade, diplomacy, whatever it happens to be. So when I look at what the Yoon administration has done, it doesn't seem to me to be like a fundamental realignment of South Korean foreign policy. Again, as Jack pointed out, I think the distinguishing factor is Yoon's insistence on using the language of values and of talking about seeking partnerships that are not purely transactional, but are based on a shared belief in ideas like freedom and democracy and a kind of what he keeps calling the rules-based international order. And South Korea has a big incentive to want to preserve something like that. If we look at the kind of shocks to supply chains and this kinds of inflation, things that have been caused by recent world events, such as the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, I think South Korea realizes for its own continued prosperity, it makes sense to have a world in which a kind of quorum of states agree on the free movement of goods and the free movement of people, and on a kind of rules-based order that can avoid some kind of unforeseen disruption. So again, I don't know if Yoon is quite realigning South Korea fundamentally, but I think he's responding to real-time pressures in a way that I think bodes well for the continued well-being of South Korea as an exporting country and a country that needs to import a lot of its goods.
Right, which also needs to ensure that there's security on the Korean Peninsula to allow for such interactions. And that being said, Jack, on a scale of 1 to 10, if I were to ask you to rate the Yoon administration's handling of the security concerns here on the peninsula, what score would you give it?
This is a difficult transitional time. So, you know, in terms of scoring it on causing or reducing tensions, probably it would be a low score. But then I'm not sure that's the policy that Yoon should or is following. You know, in terms of trying to provide security for South Korea, it would be a much higher score. Now, if we look at previous attempts, say by the past administration, there was a big effort to ease tensions and engage with Pyongyang. And all that resulted in, unfortunately, was, well, since 2022, we've had more than 100 ballistic missile tests now, the biggest ramping up ever of nuclear and missile programs in the DPRK. So now we see the focus is very much on trying to put measures in place that can protect South Korea, that can prevent an attack, and they're not necessarily the same things that reduce tension. So we're seeing the trilateral partnership between the United States and Japan, the mending of relations with Japan, building up bigger local defenses in the 3 areas, you know, the kill chain, the Korea air missile defense and the massive punishment and retaliation. I always get that one a little wrong, but building up all these areas. And of course, that can lead into more tension. But the idea is here of making South Korea safer. And it's difficult because under the Biden administration, there's a very good security arrangement with the United States. But say if Trump became president again, that could change dramatically. South Korea could be in a position where if it was attacked by North Korea, the United States might not actually come to its assistance. So building up relations with countries like Japan or other allies and building up defense here might seem the only way forward. But in terms of reducing tensions on the peninsula or making things more stable in the short term, perhaps it has the opposite effect, unfortunately.
Right. And staying here on the peninsula, Stephen, according to North Korea's state-run media, the country has started its key policy direction meeting. It began on Tuesday with Kim Jong-un claiming that the year 2023 was a year of great change for North Korea. What other issues do you suppose are topping those talks?
I just this morning went through that whole KCNA report, and sorry to say I couldn't come away with any real, tangible takeaways as to like a differing policy direction. It seems to me like what North Korea chooses to say publicly usually amounts to a kind of reaffirmation and a reiteration of what are already their core goals, which, as we see, as they keep telling us and as they keep showing us, is really doubling down on expanding the country's arsenal of weapons. We've seen a lot of ICBM tests. In 2023, they officially enshrined their nuclear policy into the country's documentation, and they were able to successfully launch a spy satellite for the first time. So it's been a relatively, in some ways, it's been a quiet year for North Korea. I feel like North Korea has not quite captured the public imagination as they have in certain past years, partly because it's been so long since they've conducted a nuclear test, but they are clearly decisively moving in a particular direction. I mean, I expect Kim Jong-un has used these types of plenary sessions in the past to sort of signal North Korea's how they intend to engage with the outside world. So I think it's unlikely that he would float any olive branches towards the prospect of dialogue with South Korea or the U.S., but it's probably a lot more likely that he will reiterate North Korea's interest in deepening ties with China and Russia. They've undertaken this really quite decisive turning inward over the past couple of years and of focusing almost exclusively on relations with those two countries. They've been closing diplomatic missions around the world and a real kind of reorientation of their diplomatic posture. But it'll be the job of people like me to parse what happens over the next few days. Perhaps Kim Jong-un will make a New Year's speech on January 1st, and we'll get some kind of clearer indication then.
Right. And staying with that, Jack, according to North Korea's state-run media, Kim Jong-un has applauded the country's advances with regard to military power. Keeping that in mind, do you expect further provocations by North Korea in the new year?
Undoubtedly. They have enshrined their nuclear arsenal in the Constitution. Kim Jong-un said there would be more offensive actions. I assume he means offensive in the military sense, but we can expect more of it. We've had the satellite launch, and they've said there'll be more satellite launches of the spy satellites. There'll be more missile tests. The latest test we had of the Hwasong 18 was at a lofted trajectory, so fired almost straight up and straight down. But to really test these weapons, you're going to have to start firing them at a different trajectory. And that is going to be a lot more provocative than firing them at a lofted angle, if that's what they do. And they're going to have to do that if they really want to test them. We see one of the reactors has been restarted that can make nuclear materials. So clearly there are plans either to mount that on warheads or to have a nuclear test. But perhaps the biggest concern might be the recent scrapping of the 2018 Inter-Korean Agreement that sort of was aimed at reducing tensions along the DMZ. South Korea partially lifting it, then North Korea fully scrapping it, and now we can, we see North Korean soldiers back with guns, recoilless rockets. We've got artillery moving back in. Are we going to see the shelling of islands? Are we going to see the sinking of ships? Are we going to see the laying of landmines? Are we going to see all of these things that we were seeing before this agreement came into effect? And of course, I hope not. I hope we don't see that. But the risk of a flashpoint or the risk of some confrontation, a very real confrontation, is so much higher now that that agreement has been scrapped. So weapons tests on the one side and big risks around the DMZ on the other.
Right. Stephen, back on the local front here in South Korea, speaking at his final cabinet meeting for the year that was back on Tuesday, President Yoon Suk-yeol spoke of how exports in the new year will also drive economic expansion here in the country. All that being said, what do you suppose are the gains of the administration's so-called sales diplomacy this year?
It's a bit early to say because, you know, Yoon, I wrote about this recently, Yoon I think has traveled more than other South Korean presidents. I think since he took office, he's been overseas something like 16 times. He's been to the US 5 times, he's been to Europe 6 times, he's been to India, he's been to Southeast Asia. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One of which I think has to do with the domestic political landscape where his party does not have a majority in the legislature. The Democratic Party has a pretty commanding majority in the National Assembly, which means that they are able to vote down a lot of his legislation. And so Yoon is really kind of hindered as to what he can accomplish domestically. So he's kind of hung his hat on foreign policy. Early in his term, that was mostly centered on boosting ties with Japan and then holding summits with the US and a trilateral summit. But I think the job, as we touched on earlier, like the job of a Korean president has for a long time been to kind of travel the world and promote Korea as whether it be a manufacturer or a burgeoning cultural powerhouse or whatever it may be. I mean, just among Yoon's more recent trips, you know, he was in the Netherlands and he held some meetings with ASML, a maker of advanced semiconductor equipment, and reached some agreements there. And while in the UK, he reached the so-called Downing Street Accord with London. And this is all well and good. I mean, it will require some kind of continued scrutiny, especially because Yoon is, in advance of those trips, Yoon was facing some kind of questions domestically, whereas the opposition and some critics were asking if he was spending all this money to go abroad, you know, what was this really, you know, what were the actual kind of concrete outcomes of this? And there may yet be some, but Yoon will face some kind of pressure to come up with some kind of verifiable, you know, here are investment deals and here are jobs being created and all the rest. And this probably will come up again next year in advance of the legislative elections of April 10th.
Right. Another issue to come up next year, Jack, is going to be the country's declining population, of course, which President Yoon Suk-yeol also touched upon during that cabinet meeting on Tuesday. Some pundits are claiming that opening doors to immigration is the only viable option that Korea has in the immediate future. What more do you care to add?
I don't think South Korea is going to open itself up to mass immigration. It's been the answer in Australia, in the United States, Canada, other places. We all have low birth rates, not as low as South Korea. I think in the US it's about 1.8, so below the 2.1% birth rate that is needed to keep the population stable. South Korea right now is around 0.78%, I think, or below. They're predicting that will fall further over the next few years, could even go down to under 0.6 or. So it is a real problem. It's a real problem because it's also an aging population. The birth rate is falling and the older people are going to need pensions. You don't have enough younger workers coming into the workforce who can pay for that or pay for anything, the critical infrastructure or the. So it is a real problem. What Yoon is saying, though, now, I think is a good policy, which is to say, let's start thinking outside of the box. We've tried this, we've tried that, we've spent millions of dollars on this, nothing has worked. So we've got to think outside the box. People have looked at the housing cost, they've looked at the cost of education, they've looked at a lot of other factors. But now, even Yoon was talking about looking at family structure, looking about gender issues, looking about the role, perhaps the fathers need to play a greater role, that women maybe need to play a less role in child rearing, and that needs to be shared out. All of that needs to be explored, and I think they probably can boost the birth rate if there really is a serious attempt to get to the bottom of this. The problem is they won't be able to boost it back up to 2.1%, because fundamentally young people are enjoying the affluence that they have as well. It's not just about those other issues. According to the UN, North Korea has a 1.8% replacement rate. So Obviously, poverty and stress, can only be factors to so much. Young people are saying, why should I go through all of these stresses? And that's a global phenomenon. That's just not South Korea. So you're not going to completely do it. Immigration will have to play some part, probably an extension of people on short-term visas, maybe some opening up. But this is going to be a problem that continues to plague South Korea for years ahead, perhaps decades ahead.
Right, it really is a daunting task. In the meantime, we're back on the foreign policy front, but moving ahead, looking ahead to next year, Stephen, the Foreign Minister nominee Cho Tae-yeol has spoken about the importance of engaging with Beijing as just as much as engaging with Washington. How would you describe Seoul's ties with Beijing as we look ahead to the new year?
One thing that I've noticed and that I was surprised by under this administration is just how vocally they have, the kind of language that they've used in calling on China when it comes to this thorny issue of North Koreans who have been apprehended in China and then get sent back to North Korea. This is something that's been going on for a long time. You hear these stories of North Koreans who have escaped into China and then resided there for some time, and then they are taken into custody by police. And there are these international regulations that govern the return of such folks. There's international dictates that say you ought not to return them if they are to face certain kinds of punishment. Previous South Korean governments have not been as vocal. I mean, under this administration, you've had the Minister of Unification, and I might get her exact title wrong, but the envoy for North Korean human rights, the ambassador for Lee Sun-kyun, I think is her name, they've spoken very openly in a number of forums, and they have kind of directly addressed China, and they've said, like, China, we call on you to honor your commitments as a member of the international community and to not send these people back. That, to me, is a kind of outstanding aspect as to how Seoul is choosing to interact with Beijing now. I think if you really want to take a step back and look at the state of relationship between the two sides, it comes down to, like so many things nowadays, semiconductors. The brutal truth is that the Chinese economy, Chinese companies are not yet able to make the type of super advanced semiconductors that South Korean companies made, so they still need to import them from South Korea. And so on the political side, the leadership in Beijing I think are treading a little bit carefully when it comes to diplomatic relations with South Korea. They don't want to push back too strongly because they realize that their economy is dependent on this kind of technology. And so I guess this is, maybe international relations scholars could teach this as an example of how trade can create political cooperation and political harmony. I think the two sides are, while they differ in certain areas, I think they realize that they have a very mutually beneficial trade relationship. And so while we haven't seen Xi Jinping come to South Korea in a long time, and I believe Yoon has not gone to Beijing, we may not see that kind of flashy, very public-facing diplomacy, but I think behind the scenes, the two sides are committed to working together for both sides' benefit.
Right. And against that backdrop, Jack, as we move into 2024, what do you suppose are some stories that look to shape Korea in the new year?
Yeah, well, carrying on from what Steve said there, I think there are mumblings that there might be a trilateral summit of leaders between Japan, China and South Korea, potentially in March. The whispers are saying. So that would be a big deal if it happens. On top of that, of course, North Korea, its missile tests, its actions are without doubt going to thread their way through the news bulletins all throughout the year. We will continue to talk about the issues around the aging society and the falling birth rate, the high real estate costs, the pressures of education, all of those other issues. They're already having a very big impact on society. It's not some future problem. It's biting now. And the other one is probably going to be the weather. Every year now we see these crazy summers. This last one we had, 3 weeks of torrential rain followed by a heat wave followed by several typhoons. The summers are becoming a nightmare, and it has a very real economic effect. It's having a devastating impact on agriculture, and it's turning everybody's lives upside down. So we're really feeling climate change at the moment, particularly in the summers. And even though it seems to be every second or third summer that really brings in this kind of mudslides and devastation, it just seems to be accelerating every year. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the next summer, we're going to be dominated by weather-related news again.
Right, definitely affecting agriculture prices as well. I mean, the proverb, an apple a day keeps a doctor away, it's becoming a very expensive proverb to put into practice.
Yeah.
Stephen, what do you believe will be some of these stories that define Korea in the new year?
Well, domestically, I think I touched on the elections earlier. I mean, I think the way that is shaping out, it's really going to determine whether or not the Yoon administration, it'll determine the legacy of the Yoon administration in some ways, because it will impact his administration's ability to pass legislation. You know, in Korean politics, we hear this term lame duck a lot, you know. So if Yoon is not, the People Power Party is not able to make some gains to win a bunch more seats, they might, you know, just whatever that is, you know, less than halfway through his term, be left in a position where they have very little leeway to accomplish much on the legislative or policy fronts. And that's all, you know, that's 4 months away. It's already dominating the news. I mean, if you look at the newspapers, it's already a lot of jockeying. You know, the name Han Dong-hoon is coming up a lot as he's not
former Justice Minister.
Yeah, he's not going. He's saying that he's not going to run in the election himself, but he's going to oversee this ruling party committee whereby they get themselves in position for that. So that will make a big difference. But it's the old, I mean, it's probably the same issues that dominated this year will continue into next year. You know, can the economy achieve a kind of sustained breakthrough and maybe get to the like 2% growth rate or maybe even 3%? That would rely a lot on global trade flows and things like semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries and all the rest. But
right, like we say, many questions to few answers then.
Yeah.
All right.
Isn't it always like that?
Right. All right, Stephen, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Jack, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.
Korea. Some people call it the country of Taekwondo.
People are more interested in Korean culture and other aspects of it, and one of those things is Taekwondo.
Surtout, ne commencez jamais le taekwondo, parce que si jamais un jour vous commencez, vous ne pourrez jamais vous arrêter d'en faire.
아, 정말 이렇게 제 인생을 좌우할지는 정말 몰랐어요. 왜냐하면 태권도의 나라, 한국에서 태권도를 하고 싶어서 한국에 처음 왔는데 지금은 13년째 살고 있습니다. 태권도 이런 무술입니다.
저는 사실 한 달만 하고 포기할 줄 알았어요. 근데 너무 재밌어요.
What I really like about Taekwondo is that it doesn't only give you the physical abilities, such as like flexibility or strength, it also gives you the mental abilities.
I love the spirit of Taekwondo. It's great martial arts with a lot of respect, a lot of values. Also with the pumse, very beautiful techniques. It's a sport that you can, it's a martial art that you can practice from 7 to your old age.
I've never seen them be so committed to anything if they've played other sports, but nothing like this before.
Especially when like two very little kids are fighting, because it's really fun to watch.
So it's a great way for all of us to do this together.
I'm gonna keep doing Taekwondo until this becomes a black belt.